Hi, my name is Ryan Duncan, and I will be presenting on the comparison between Hurricane Katrina and the Nepal earthquake. Early in the morning on August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast of the United States. When the storm made landfall, it came as a Category 3 rating with winds of up to 140 miles per hour. The storm itself did a great deal of damage, but its aftermath was more catastrophic. Levee breaches led to massive flooding, causing hundreds of thousands of people in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama to be displaced from their homes. Now, looking at the Nepal earthquake occurred on April 15, 2015 at 11:56 a.m. The April 2015 Nepal earthquake killed nearly 9,000 people and injured nearly 22,000 people. 10 being the highest on the Richter scale, this event registered as an 8 in terms of magnitude. In terms of disaster recovery response, both governments had similar actions in place as far as providing military and medical support. The Nepalese government had more focus on their military as they provided 90% of their soldiers to the affected regions of Nepal. When looking at the recovery plan prior to the event, both events had a similar concept to have supplies stockpiled at the affected locations. Except in Nepal, due to the earthquake and its randomness of it happening, they were not prepared enough to have their supplies in that area. As opposed to Hurricane Katrina, FEMA had these stages and locations for supplies to be near the Gulf Coast region for these affected areas. In events of these magnitudes, it's tough to plan accordingly. So in Hurricane Katrina, on September 2nd, Congress had approved $10.5 billion aid package for relief and rescue efforts in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. On September 3rd, the government requested 40,000 personnel from the National Guard to assist in the Gulf Coast region. In Nepal, military helicopters and volunteer workers were sent to Nepal for search and rescue efforts. The government also ferried relief supplies to victims of the earthquake. When comparing contingency plans, you can see that there was more success with Hurricane Katrina. The governments and FEMA had allocated nearly $320 million to roughly 185,000 survivors, while also creating a counseling group called the Louisiana Spirit. Compared to the Nepal earthquake, there was so much tension and lack of leadership that it hampered the relief efforts of all victims of the earthquake in Nepal and even getting any type of relief funding to these citizens as well. When comparing the response plans, you look at Hurricane Katrina had the idea to have a FEMA supervisor at the critical locations that could help request specific resources as needed. In Nepal, since they didn't have a such as the FEMA agency, they had to gather medical staff to the affected area and also have equipment sent to those areas to help remove rubble and start the carry and search rescue operations and set up relief camps. The response team composition for Hurricane Katrina consisted of the government deciding to use a joint division supervisor. The supervisor was co-located with an emergency manager at the county level. FEMA liaisons were dispersed amongst the counties that were critically impacted. In Nepal, the government collected and dispersed health staff to the affected area as well as military personnel. Now that I have reviewed and compared all the different segments of each event, I will now discuss the overall recovery efforts and determine if they were successful or not. Beginning with Hurricane Katrina, the response to Hurricane Katrina showed that there was an unfamiliarity in the areas of leadership, plan discipline, and most importantly, incident management. A response plan should unify forces towards a common goal, in this case, relief and recovery. As a result, this had a tremendously negative effect on the survivors and residents of the Gulf Coast region. Now, looking at the Nepal earthquake, The Nepalese government did not have an emergency response unit or plan in place that could have handled a crisis of this scale. The unpreparedness of the government, political instability that caused blockage in supply of essential materials, and financial woes were all corporate culprits for the lack of proper recovery efforts.
Hello, my name is James Kazmersky, and I am discussing the differences and similarities between Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Harvey. This slide looks at the selected disaster as an event, duration, statistics, and human impact. This second slide looks at the state and federal disaster recovery efforts during both hurricanes. This third slide looks at the disaster recovery plans in place prior to the event. This slide looks at changes to plans following the events. This slide looks at the contingency planning and surviving the aftermath of both events. This slide looks at response plans for natural disasters. This slide looks at response team compositions. And this slide looks at the overall efforts if they were successful.
Now taking a look at Hurricane Katrina versus the September 11 attacks. Select the disasters as an event, duration, statistics, or human impact. Hurricane Katrina made its landfall as a Category 1 hurricane in southeastern Florida on August 25, 2005. As Katrina grew as a tropical storm, it then made landfall as a Category 3 near Burris, Louisiana on August 29th. The September 11 attacks. On the morning of September 11, 2001, there were a series of 4 coordinated terrorist attacks by the Islamic group Al-Qaeda. The planes were hijacked by 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists. In the slides to follow, comparing Hurricane Katrina and the September 11 attacks, you will take a look at the state and federal disaster recovery relief efforts, the disaster recovery plans in place prior to the events, changes to the plans following the event, contingency planning and surviving the aftermath, response plans for the natural disasters, the response team composition, and were there any overall recovery efforts that were successful in both events. Take a look and I hope you enjoy. Now that you have reviewed the comparison of Hurricane Katrina and the September 11 attacks, we will look at the overall recovery efforts. Hurricane Katrina disaster exposed a disconnect between preparation and response. Though the possibility of a catastrophic hurricane and flood was a staple of local lore and expert reports, New Orleans failed to plan for Katrina with the urgency that the response required. Plans were made that never thoroughly rehearsed. Looking at the September 11 attacks, over 6,000 people were killed and buildings were destroyed. Nearly a year after the terrorist attacks, workers continued to remove debris and recover bodies from the ruins of the Twin Towers at Lower Manhattan's former World Trade Center complex. Looking at both of these disasters, they each tell us that we should be prepared for disasters and that we should have efforts in place to recover from them. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Chanel Rhodes and I'll be presenting a comparison of Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria. Hurricane Katrina hit land as a Category 5 storm in Mississippi and Alabama. However, it had the largest impact in the areas along the Gulf Coast and in New Orleans, Louisiana. Katrina was the most costliest hurricane to ever hit the United States. In comparison, Hurricane Maria, at its strongest, it was also a Category 5 hurricane. Although it hit the areas of the Caribbean, the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico was the most affected by Hurricane Maria. The hurricane left 100% of the island without power, and it also put it at the third costliest hurricane in history. The government had to decide quickly where and how to begin disaster recovery relief efforts. During Katrina, the government's initial focal points were search and rescue, the evacuation of stranded citizens, patching levees, draining water, and the recovery of the deceased. In addition, federal funding was provided and implemented in phases in an attempt to ensure funds were distributed effectively for relief efforts. During Hurricane Maria, hundreds of federal government agents reported to the grounds of Puerto Rico to assist in the recovery efforts. One of the main focuses was to restore power to as many citizens as possible, since the entire island did not have power. There were also major needs for medical help, food, water, and first aid supplies. Pre-Katrina, many of the disaster recovery plans in place provided instruction on traffic, rescue, electricity, and medical concerns. The plans included removing everyone from high-threat areas as quickly as possible by strategically planning escape routes and rerouting traffic through Mississippi. For Hurricane Maria, the people of Puerto Rico were advised by FEMA to follow many different precautions to prepare them for Hurricane Maria. Disaster recovery planning included information about emergency kits and family communication planning in order to ensure citizens had a plan in the event they had to wait for search and rescue. During both instances, FEMA played a major role during the recovery planning. After both Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria, the government realized that a lot of the planning prior to devastation needed revision. For Hurricane Katrina, one of the main things that needed to be revised was infrastructure planning. And for Hurricane Maria, there needed to be more planning in reference to the amount of supplies that were readily available for the citizens after the hurricane. Pre-Hurricane Katrina, the government provided the citizens of Louisiana with a short 20-hour notice to evacuate the area. Contingency planning prepared the government officials to begin planning to evacuate as soon as possible. In comparison, Hurricane Maria, the government did not successfully plan for the medical needs that would be necessary after the destruction that Hurricane Maria caused. So the government realized that they need to send more medical professionals over on the grounds in Puerto Rico, as opposed to trying to send in flights to fly people out of Puerto Rico to other parts of the United States to assist with medical needs. Future response plans include FEMA partnering with the Department of Homeland Security to ensure strategic planning and response in the event of a natural disaster. On the contrary, Hurricane Maria had several bureaucratic failures which prevented rescue efforts from being carried out quickly and efficiently after the hurricane. The local and federal government held briefings 6 days after the hurricane, which placed a slowdown on the response and relief efforts. Going forward, the government has planned to hold briefings a lot sooner in order to ensure that the necessary help is sent more quickly. In Louisiana, FEMA and the Environmental Protection Agency played roles during relief efforts in response to Hurricane Katrina. The EPA assisted with going to survey the damage that was done and what needed to be tended to once FEMA got their funds together to help with relief. Hurricane Maria, on the other hand, FEMA, the National Guard, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms contributed to relief efforts by creating teams to assist on the ground in Puerto Rico. The National Guard assisted with search and rescue, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms assisted by providing aircrafts which were able to transport people to and from Puerto Rico. Overall, recovery efforts in Louisiana continue to flourish after the disastrous hurricane that hit the city of New Orleans in August of 2005, which caused unimaginable devastation. The citizens of Puerto Rico also continue to recover from devastation after being hit by Hurricane Maria. Although many citizens remain without power and many businesses remain closed, the government is doing what they can to get citizens back on track in their living areas. Many citizens in New Orleans decided to evacuate and not return to their dwelling places in Louisiana. However, many citizens in Puerto Rico decided to actually stay and try to rebuild their homes in Puerto Rico.
And this is a list of references that I used in putting this presentation together.